Right, we stay with the border post closures. Joining me now to talk about the effectiveness of this move to curb the spread of COVID-19, it's Wits University Associate Professor at the African Center for Migration and Society, Vearey, as well as Zimbabwe Community South Africa Spokesperson, Bongani Mkhwanazi. Good evening to both of you, and thank you very much for your time. Joe, I'll start with you. As a response to the rising number of infections, South Africa has adjusted the lockdown level 3 restrictions to include 20 of our land borders. The president yesterday mentioning the 6 of the busiest ones. Is this the right solution?
I would argue not, for several reasons. I think the key issue is really carefully thinking about the ways in which we manage our land borders, and recognizing the challenges that they present when we're not even considering the context of COVID. We know that closing land borders to individuals who are moving from neighboring countries is going to present a range of challenges, and it is unfortunately likely to push individuals who are in the process of returning to South Africa for work, for education, to join families, as normally happens in January every year, as it's potentially going to push them into irregular routes, which not only places them as individuals at increased risk and danger, but also presents wider challenges to our public health response. We really need to be ensuring that everybody traveling into South Africa is able to access the same COVID protocols as everybody else. And this is increasingly important when we're thinking about issues of access to vaccines. And my big concern is that once again, we are potentially scapegoating foreign nationals. It's a convenient diversion from other challenges in the country at the moment. And once again, suggests that those crossing borders are those that are bringing COVID with them, of which we have no evidence.
And the long term, of course, the minister speaking even earlier is talking of a one-stop border post standardization, particularly when he refers to the Beitbridge border. But I suppose he's talking about all the borders across where the countries would then come together and agree on one method and one process of processing people in and out of those borders. And that is to reduce the issue of congestion, because that is possibly the highest risk we have around transmission at this particular point. So in the short term, what could be the solutions for that congestion?
I mean, I think we need to think about this in two ways. On the first instance, we need to have an immediate response in terms of a more kind of humanitarian crisis response. I think some would argue that the border closures are an attempt to do that. I'm not convinced. I think we need to, secondly, be having a much more careful consideration of the ways that we process the movement of people across our borders. And what is it on the South African side that is causing these delays? And that's where we really need to be thinking. A one-stop border crossing provides some opportunities, particularly when we're thinking about COVID. It encourages a bilateral response, so whereby neighboring countries come together to much more carefully consider joint responses to management of COVID, both in South Africa, both in neighboring countries, but importantly regionally. This all comes back to the fact that we cannot escape the fact that we live in a country and a region of high levels of population mobility. That is part of the way that the societies, the economy functions. And so putting in additional taxpayers' money, additional energy and effort in trying to reduce movement across borders, I think is a futile effort. We know that the minister previously was talking about the reasons for having to shut down civic services and reduce the number of civic services that are going to be available to South African citizens for the next 4 weeks. And we really need to think about the fact that much of that is related to cost and the inability of the department to run the departmental offices in the ways that are needed for citizens. So why we are then diverting funds into certain forms of border management that have been shown to be cost ineffective seems even more futile.
Bongani Mkhwanazi, he speaks for the Zimbabwe Community South Africa. Bongani, what do you make of the decision to close the borders, particularly the the Beitbridge border between South Africa and Zimbabwe. And of course, part of the reasons being forwarded are that this will help reduce congestion and the high risk of transmission.
Look, it seems like this was done as a reaction to the congestion that happened last week. The closing of borders may look like it's a way of reducing movement, etc. But the problem is that people still navigate other channels of crossing. The reality is that there is an economic crisis in Zimbabwe, which sends economic refugees to South Africa. But also with the hard lockdown that is happening in Zimbabwe, most people try to seek refuge, particularly economic refuge in South Africa. So the closing of borders, while it is meant to curb the movement of people and apparently to reduce congestion, I'm not seeing it as a hard and fast solution now. I think the setting up of a one-stop shop is the one that seems to make more sense to us, to say the synchronization of border crossing, stamping, presenting COVID test certificates, and all the health checks be done synchronously between the two governments in a sort of bilateral arrangement.
Yeah. Talk to me then about what do you think led to that humanitarian crisis. Other people were dubbing it that, seeing those people for days and days on those queues with no social distancing, others even losing their lives because they were not getting food, they were not getting any medical attention. It was becoming quite a humanitarian crisis. What is at the heart of that?
It was a lack of synchronization, really, between the two governments and the two border managements, because Zimbabwe implemented a hard lockdown. The curfew times were different, with Zimbabwe closing the border off at 6 and South Africa also closing at 9. So with the curfews that were not in synchrony, it already presented challenges where the Zimbabwean side is said to be doing things manually while the South African side is doing electronically, but these are not in sync. It's in a way where we realize as Zimbabwe community South Africa that the realities that are there are not being taken into consideration, that there is a situation where Zimbabweans are flocking to South Africa for economic refuge. Dismissing it is not going to send the situation scurrying for cover somewhere. There is a hard reality. People are flocking here. They need opportunities, and a better bilateral management framework needs to be created until situation is resolved.
Well, Joe, one would look at this and say the minister has been talking about this even with other issues that have got to do with border management that have arisen, including fugitives that have left the country, and said, well, generally we have a situation at our borders. What are the historical issues that we have, or shall we say historical failures in managing border movements in South Africa?
Sorry, was that to me? Sorry,
yes,
I lost.
Yeah,
sorry. I mean, I think we have to really recognize and think about where these borders came from and why these borders are still there. And we do need to recognize that they were created and they were colonial imports. They were in many ways arbitrary. They divided communities, they divided people, they removed people from certain countries and regions of their own being. So we really need to think about the ways in which borders today manifest and the ways in which individuals need to be able to connect across these state lines, whether it's daily commutes for education, for access to schools, learners, for cross-border trade, and for other reasons. But we really need to think about the ways that we're managing those processes. And I think what we're seeing over the last few years is an increasingly restrictive immigration policy within South Africa that is happening in synchrony with a increasingly securitized, militarized response to the ways that we're trying to manage those borders. We need to really think about what is the gain for South Africa in building these borders, making them stronger, thicker, higher, etc. When we know very clearly the dependency of the South African and regional economy on people moving. It's a key livelihood strategy for South Africans and for people from other countries. It benefits our fiscus, and it's therefore something we need to be able to manage far more carefully. We need to ensure that our responses are much more holistic. Our responses take in consideration multiple factors and multiple sectors. And I think one thing we've not been speaking about adequately is about the needs for ensuring the right to protection for individuals seeking asylum in South Africa. We've not heard from the minister what these new border closure policies would mean in terms of people seeking asylum. We've not had any clarification on whether the documents that individuals hold as asylum seekers that will have expired during the past year of lockdown, where individuals have been given an amnesty to the end of January, is this also going to be increased in the same way that it has been to the end of March, for example, for tourists and other visitors in South Africa? We've closed land borders, but we haven't closed international airports. And we have to recognize that there is a big class divide here in whom the borders are being closed to. And I think that's something we need to take a far more careful and critical look at.
That was Wits University Associate Professor at the African Center for Migration and Society, Vearey, and Zimbabwean Community South Africa spokesperson, Bonga.